Hey guys, welcome back to the Curly Reader. My name's Amanda, and today I'm going to share with you my top 10 middle grade reads of 2021. All right, so as you guys all know, I read a lot of middle grade books. About half of my reading every year is just middle grade, and so I definitely felt that it was appropriate that I split out my favorite middle grade books from my favorite adult and YA books. I let you know my favorite adult and YA books yesterday. I will link that video down below in the description box, but today we're going to talk about my top 10 middle grade reads of 2021. So, I read some really good middle grade books this year that I'm excited to tell you about. Some of these were 4-star reads, some of these were 5-star reads, but all of them I really, really enjoyed. And so I hope that you will check them out and that you will love them too if you have not read them already. So let's just get into it. The first book that I want to talk to you about is the only graphic novel on this list. I didn't read as many graphic novels this year as I normally do, and so only one of them made it to a favorites list this year. But the one that did is The Secret Garden on 81st Street. This is by Ivy Noel Weir, and this is a modern retelling of The Secret Garden in graphic novel form. And so you have Mary, who has recently been orphaned, and she goes to live with her uncle in New York City, and her uncle is just very reclusive. He travels a lot, he's very quiet, and she is just kind of trying to figure out life in New York City. She's from California originally, from Silicon Valley, so she's trying to figure out how to live in New York, and she finds out that her uncle has this locked away garden on his rooftop that his spouse had previously been taking care of, and when his spouse died, they decided to lock the door and nobody has been up there since. And so she decides to kind of take that under her wing. You get to meet Colin and Dickon, and it's just so much fun. One of the things that I loved about this book is that Sparrow Robin. Robin was a bodega cat, so that was a lot of fun, like the translation. I love the way that they translated Colin, who is sick in the original book, how they translated that into a modern day version. It just worked so well, and I really, really enjoyed it. And so that was the lone graphic novel that made the list, but I really enjoyed this one. All right, the next one that I want to talk about, I've been raving about a lot lately. I talked about it in my December wrap up. I talked about it in my top 5 of the quarter, and so I'm going to talk about it here too. And that is A Kind of Spark by Elle McNicol. This is a Scottish author. The book takes place in Scotland. It's recently been, I think, released here in the US though. And this follows our main character, Addie, who is autistic. She is autistic. Her sister is autistic. And she is in elementary school. I think she's in 5th or 6th grade. I think 5th grade is about the age for this. But she is in school, and she unfortunately has a teacher who is not understanding of her needs and is not supportive of her in any way, shape, or form. And so she has a very, very difficult time at school. But also at school, they are learning about their town's history. And part of their town history is that they had witch trials, similar to the Salem witch trials here in the US. They had witch trials where, back in, a few hundred years ago, they would kill women who were different because they thought they were witches. And Addie really identifies with these women, and this story really resonates with her. And so she wants to have a memorial in the town or construct a memorial in the town to commemorate these women who were unjustly killed. And the town isn't really on board with that. They don't want to bring attention to negative things that happened in the town. And so this is really about Addie fighting for that memorial to be constructed in her town, but it's also just her story of day-to-day life, living with autism. And I love this book because it put words to a lot of things that autistic children deal with and go through, and it talks about the correct terminology used for things. It talks about things that people who do not deal with autism may not even have any idea that these things affect autistic kids. Things like the lighting in rooms, things like, it was just so good. I've raved about it, like I said, a lot recently, and so I'm not going to go on much beyond that, but definitely if you have an autistic child or an autistic person in your life, I would highly recommend checking this out because I learned a ton reading this book. All right, next book I want to talk about, I read back during middle grade March, and that is Wolff Wilder by Katherine Rundell. I did a vlog where I read all of Katherine Rundell's currently published work, and this was my favorite one. I really enjoyed this book. This book takes place in Russia, and it follows Feo. She and her mother train, like back when this book takes place, I don't even remember what year it is that it takes place. It was a while ago, I know that. But back during the time of this book, the royalty and the elite in Russia would capture wolves and keep them as pets. And then when they got to be a little bit too rambunctious, they would re-release them out into the wild. Well, a domesticated animal will not survive out in the wild. And so Feo and her mom wild the wolves, and so they teach them how to survive out in the wild. And then things start happening. The elite, like some of the generals and stuff, don't want them doing that anymore. They don't want them working with the wolves. They don't want the wolves around town, things like that. And so things just happen. Through the course of the story, Feo ends up going on a journey out in the woods in the snow with a couple of wolves, and it is just, I love the story. I loved the imagery and the atmosphere in this story. It was so well done. A great glimpse just into a little bit of like Russian. It's definitely not like historically accurate, I'm sure, but just like a little glimpse into kind of the climate in Russia. And yeah, really, really love this one. And I mean, that cover, also gorgeous. So that one made the list. Another one that made the list that I've talked quite a bit about is Renegade Reporters. This is by Alyssa Brent Wiseman, and this is her 2021 release. This book follows Ash and a couple of her friends. They have always been part of their school's like television news team. Her school, like the morning announcements is actually a news show, and the students get to participate. It takes place in an elementary school, and something happened the year before, and she ends up getting kind of kicked off of the show. And so her and her friends decide they are going to create their own news network and put it on YouTube. With the permission of their parents. This book definitely goes into like parental consent, like you have to have your parents' permission to do things. They have to approve things first, which I as a parent really appreciated. But they decide they're gonna do this news story and just put it out on YouTube. So they're searching for a story, and they kind of fall into one in that they learn that their school's software program that they use to like do all of the students' assignments through their you think like, I don't know, like Schoology or Google Classrooms or things like that. Like their software platform has been selling their information to ad agencies. And so it just kind of gets into the ethics of that. Is that okay? Who approves of it? What does that mean for you as a student? Things like that. And I just thought that the topic of this was so on point for today's climate with kids. This is one that I would encourage children to read because I think it's important that they are aware of what their online presence does, their online actions and behaviors, what that in turn will like bring back to you. And so yeah, I really, really like this one, highly recommend it. And yeah, that was another one that made the list. Another one that I read during middle grade March is Orion Lost. This is by Alistair Chisholm. This is a UK release. I was able to get it, I think, on Amazon though, so you can get it there, but this is a UK release, and this is a sci-fi book, which was so much fun. So this follows Beth. She is on a spaceship out in outer space, and something her and the spaceship full of people are on their way to another planet. And something happens along the way, and all of a sudden she is waking up and realizing that all of the adults have been incapacitated, and it's up to this group of like 5 13-year-olds to figure out where they are. Their spaceship is lost in space, so they have to figure out where they are, how to get back, what's going on. They have people chasing them, people, aliens, who knows, chasing them. And it was a lot of fun. Totally unbelievable, sure, but so much fun. The writing was so fun. The characters were well fleshed out. Like, this book was a blast. So if you're into sci-fi, like, definitely check this one out. It was just a fun one. So that one definitely had to make the list. All right, another one that I actually got from NetGalley, and I haven't heard anybody else talk about this book. I just found it on NetGalley and I read it, and I adored this book, and it is called The Sun Will Come Out. It's by Joanne Levy, and this book follows Bea, who is going to camp for the first time with her best friend, and she's so excited about it. It's going to be the best summer ever, and then she finds out that her best friend is actually not going to go. She's going to go to horse camp instead, and her parents can't afford horse camp, and she's really upset about it. So she ends up going to this Jewish camp, and her friend isn't there, and when she gets there, she realizes that her friend's older brother is there, who she might have a crush on, and she kind of panics, and she starts having panic attacks and has anxiety attacks, starts breaking out in hives, and is just, it's a mess. And so she ends up spending a lot of time in the nurse's cabin, and there meets a friend, and this book was so heartwarming. There is definitely a heavy presence of the musical Annie, because the camp musical that year is Annie, and different people are trying out for it, and they're watching it, the movie version of it, and I love Annie. It is like one of my absolute favorite musicals. And so this book was just so heartwarming. I loved it so much. It was so much fun and so uplifting. And like I said, I haven't heard anybody else talking about it. So go check it out. It's a brand new release, and I think that you'll just really enjoy it too. All right, another one that I want to talk about that I absolutely loved is The Best Worst Summer. This is by Elizabeth Eulberg, and this follows Peyton in the present day timeline. It's a dual timeline, but the present day timeline follows Peyton, who is super bummed out because she just moved away from her best friends. Her family moved. She is not happy about it, and she's kind of sitting on the sidelines now while her best friend and her group of friends, her soccer team, is all going to soccer camp together and, creating all these new memories together. And she still wants to stay in touch with them, but she's really jealous hearing about all the things that they're getting to do together. And so her dad puts her to work and tells her to go do some yard work out in the backyard, and she's digging in the flower garden and finds a time capsule that was buried in her backyard. She opens it up and finds out that it is a time capsule that was buried by some best friends back in the 1980s. And so she is on a mission to figure out who these people were, what happened. There was a note in it that said something along the lines of, "I'm sorry, it shouldn't have happened," or something along those lines. So she kind of is on this mission to investigate. And so the second timeline is the 1980s timeline, and we're following Melissa, who her and her best friend Jessica are just gonna have the best summer ever. They're hanging out all the time. Things are going great. Unfortunately, things at home aren't fantastic for Melissa. There's a lot of stuff going on within her family. And so you're kind of figuring that out. There are so many amazing 80s references in this to pagers, and they're super obsessed with the New Kids on the Block and just listening to them and mixtapes and, all the fun things. So I'm sure like a huge part of the reason that I love this book so much was the nostalgia of it. It also takes place in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I'm from Minnesota. And so that also probably lent to it. But overall, it was just a really good book about friendship and how friendship changes and how it doesn't change, and things like that. And so it was so much fun. Such a great summer book to read. Highly recommend you have your kids check it out. You check it out, like whatever. It was a blast. All right, and then the next one that I want to talk about is Land of the Cranes by Aida Salazar. This is a book that is written in verse, and it follows Betita, who is a 9-year-old girl living in California, and her family ends up getting deported. They're from Mexico, I believe, and they end up getting deported. Her dad gets deported right away, and then her mom and her end up kind of on the border in a camp. And it really just tells a story of their lives in this camp, in like these holding cells basically, for months on end. And this was a book that really opened my eyes and challenged my political beliefs. And I really appreciated that. I love when books can challenge me and change the way that I think about things and give me new perspective on things. And this is one of those books. So like I said, it's a book and verse. It's a very fast read or listen. I listened to the audiobook and it was fantastic. Highly recommend doing it that way too. But it's just this story about family and community and culture, and I absolutely loved it, regardless of where you stand on your viewpoints about the border and the issues at the border with immigration and deportations and all of that. I recommend you pick this up and just be open to the perspective that it gives, and I think that you'll learn a lot from it. So that was another one that made the list. All right, and then we're getting to my top 2. So the rest of these weren't in any particular order, but these are my top 2 books of the year, middle grade wise. The first of which is actually a trilogy. I just lumped them all together, and that is the Finding Langston trilogy. So there's Finding Langston, Leaving Lyman, and Being Clem. Being Clem was just released this year, but I read all 3 of these this year, and they were so good. These all take place kind of during the Great Migration period in the US, so after World War II. And it was a time in US history where a lot of people a lot of Black people moved out of the South and they moved up into the Midwest. Sorry if you can hear the traffic. But they moved up into the Midwest. And so in this first book, we're following Langston, whose family came from, I believe, Alabama. Yep, Alabama, 1946. They move up from Alabama. This is a tiny, tiny little book. But him and his dad move to Chicago, and it is about him being able to really experience a library for the first time. Because he's Black, he wasn't allowed to go into the library in his old town, and so he's able to go into the library in Chicago, and he finds Langston Hughes's poetry and just really becomes like engulfed in this world of poetry and words, and it is such a beautiful book. Amazing. The next book in the series, Leaving Lyman, follows Lyman, who is from Mississippi. His dad is spending some time in Parchman Penitentiary. Oh my goodness, I cannot say that word. The Parchman Farm. Penitentiary. All right. Anyway, moving on. It was a prison. And his dad is spending some time there. So he is living with his grandparents, and then some things happen and he has to go live with his aunt, who lives in Milwaukee or Chicago. I don't even remember now. I think she lived in Milwaukee or somewhere in Wisconsin. And then he ends up having to go and live in Chicago for a while with his mom and his stepdad. And it's just about the relationship that he has with all of these adults in his life who, despite their best efforts, continue to fail him over and over and over again. And this is one of the books this year that just made me sob, because I felt so bad for this kid who had no one in his life that was doing right by him. I mean, all of these people, not all of them were intentional. Some of them were. Not all of them were intentional, but despite their best efforts, they just kept failing him over and over and over again. And despite that, Lyman just kept trudging along. And I loved this book so much. It touched my heart. It changed my perspective once again on how I view certain things in life. And I could not say enough good things about this book. I loved it. And then the last one in the trilogy was Being Clem. This one follows Clem, whose dad dies right at the very end of World War II. He died in the Port Chicago disaster. And so he's living with his mom. And this is all about him trying to kind of fill the shoes of his dad a little bit, and like growing up to be a man without having that father there. This talks a lot about facing your fears and learning new things and just owning your identity. And I really enjoyed this one too. So of the 3, I would say Leaving Lyman was probably my favorite, but just the trilogy as a whole had to go on this list. All right, and then probably my favorite middle grade book that I read this year was The Length of a String by Alyssa Brent Wiseman. This book, I have raved about this book so much this year. This is a book about, is it Amari? Is that her name? Imani. This is a book about Imani. Imani is Black. She was adopted by Jewish parents, so she grew up Jewish, and she's preparing for her bat mitzvah. And as part of her bat mitzvah, she, instead of having a huge party, her parents told her they would get her a really nice gift. She wants to ask to find her birth parents, but she's afraid to talk to her parents about it. And so she's kind of trying to like get up the urge to ask her parents about it. And then her great-grandmother passes away, or her great-grandmother? Yeah, great-grandmother passes away. And so when they go and they sit in Shiva, is that right? For her, she gets to talk to her grandpa a little bit and finds out that her grandma left her all of her books. So she left the grandkids all of her books. And so when they go back and try to like start cleaning things up, she's looking through the books and finds her grandma's old diary. And it is a diary that documents her grandmother's experience fleeing Luxembourg during World War II. And so through this book, you are getting Imani's perspective, present day, but then you're also getting those journal entries or diary entries from World War II of her grandmother fleeing Luxembourg, and she comes over to the United States and lives in New York City. And so I adored the way that this book was structured, because you're only getting the diary entries from the past timeline. And so Imani and her friend are kind of reading it together, and they're trying to puzzle together what exactly is going on. And then you're also getting that perspective of Imani's current day, what's happening with her bat mitzvah and her parents and her identity and being adopted and things like that. I will say the adoption thing in here, her mom is horrible and handles a lot of things really, really badly. But I still love the story. So, yeah, I cannot say enough good things about the story. I cried so much reading this. I started crying about a third of the way in, and I feel like I didn't stop until like 2 weeks after I finished it. It was just so good. It was so touching. It was so heartwarming, and I loved it so much. So that was my favorite of the year. So yeah, those were my favorite middle grade of 2021. Have you read any of these? Did you enjoy any of them? Do you now want to read any of them? Let me know all your thoughts about them down below. Let me know if you read middle grade, what some of your favorites of the year were. If you don't, you should start. And yeah, that's going to do it for today. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you stick around and subscribe. And until next time, see ya.